Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, if you've heard me talk about them, you know that one of my favorite units in military history is the Black Watch. They're not only a Scottish unit, they are also Black Watch units from Canada, and specifically the story of the Black Watch in World War I, and I'm going to be telling some of that story when I visit Belgium here in just a few weeks. So naturally was really excited when I saw that one of my favorite channels, Simple History, has a brand new video out about the Scottish Black Watch in World War I. Now, this unit continues to exist to this day. I believe they are the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Scots Regiment. There was a lot of reorganization that has taken place, and there's now just a single regiment in Scotland, but there are multiple battalions to it. I think the Black Watch is the 3 Scots. So I'm excited to dive into this one. I expect to learn some things I didn't already know, and I invite you to join me on the journey. As always, the link is in the description to the original content if you want to check not only this video out, but all of the great content over on that channel. Please do so. Let's dive in. Forgot to mention before we get started, I've got one of my favorite pieces of memorabilia that I have is this Black Watch hat pin. So this would go on the hat of a soldier between World War I and World War II. In both wars, it was the same one. So we don't know for sure when this one is from, but it's definitely from that era. So,
War I, Ladies from Hell.
All right, I need to mention right off the bat, and this is something I addressed in my video from the battlefield of the Somme. That term, ladies from hell, is one of those that's kind of shrouded in some mystery. And what I mean by that is the typical story that you hear is that the Germans called the Scottish soldiers wearing kilts ladies from hell. And it's a really cool name, and it sounds fun, but as far as I have been able to determine, there are no contemporary German sources that ever called them ladies from hell. It seems to be a story that has its roots on the Allied side, where Allied soldiers said that the Germans called them that, but we have no writings. We have hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of journals and diaries and letters from German soldiers at the time. Very popular for them to do that. And we have a lot of information and details about what the Germans thought of the Allies, and none of them that I've ever been able to find out about ever refer to the Scottish soldiers as ladies from hell. Same thing with the Devil Dogs, the Marines. The U.S. Marines, the story is that they got the nickname Devil Dogs by the Germans at the Battle of Belleau Wood. The word Devil Dogs, as used to refer to the Marines, predates Belleau Wood by multiple months and first appeared in print in American newspapers. So just to kind of get that out of the way.
In the history of the British Armed Forces, there have been many regiments whose glory and fame were forged on battlefields across the world. However, there is a unit whose devotion to duty and gallantry earned it the honor to be ranked among Britain's finest. These are the men of the 3rd Battalion, the Royal Regiment of Scotland. This is the unit of Scottish Highlanders, also known as the Black Watch.
Now, it's important to note for audiences who might not be familiar with how the British regimental system works. In World War I, you had regiments, but they weren't, it can be confusing if you're used to an American system of how regiments work. So, for example, in the American Civil War, you have a regiment like, say, the 20th Ohio Infantry, and they served as a unit. The whole regiment was in one single brigade. World War II, you have units like the 506th Parachute Infantry from Band of Brothers. It was a single regiment with 3 battalions. Each battalion had 3 companies in it. Not how it worked in the British Army at this point. What we're dealing with are regiments that are basically a name and a history, but not serving as a single unit. So you might have, for example, a regiment like the East Lancashire Regiment. You didn't have all of the men of the East Lancashire Regiment serving together in one unit. You had battalions that, there might be 10, 20 battalions for a regiment, and they're serving in multiple fronts, in multiple brigades, multiple divisions. And so you might have one Black Watch battalion serving at the Somme and another Black Watch battalion serving, in a completely different part of the world. So the Black Watch describes all of those battalions that are a part of the Black Watch, but they weren't all serving together in one place at one time.
The Black Watch is a unit with a long history of service. In the early 18th century, they were formed following the famous 1715 Jacobite uprising in Scotland. For years afterwards, even though the rebellion was crushed, the northern regions of the country were far from being pacified.
Yeah, and the Black Watch, my understanding is it was kind of a royalist unit that was initially made up of men who were loyal to the crown, who were in opposition to the Jacobite rebellions that were happening. In a lot of ways, the Jacobite rebellions were kind of a civil war that was going on in Scotland between, people loyal to the existing king and loyal to the claimant to the throne under the Jacobite succession.
Warring clans were still causing trouble, and King George I's administration was unable to control them because he was not in a position to garrison his troops in Scotland for any length of time. So he decided to form a force among the Highlanders themselves to help maintain law and order in Scotland. On May 12, 1725, he commissioned men from 4 of the loyal clans, the Campbells, Grants, Frasers, and Monroes.
Which is kind of funny when you consider the Campbells are one of these clans, because the Campbells famously are the ones who perpetrate the Glencoe massacre. I think that was in 1692. And I am descended from the MacDonalds, who were on the receiving end of that massacre. So even though I am descended from people who were on the wrong end of the Black Watch at that point, absolutely loved this unit.
And formed a force comprising 6 companies under the command of General George Wade. Their task was to maintain law and order in Scotland by preventing clashes between the clans. The unit became a regiment of the line of the regular army in 1739 with a total strength of 10 companies. The following year, the unit became the 43rd Highland Regiment of Foot, and in 1742 they were renumbered to the 42nd Regiment. Since then, the unit was also known as the 43. However, men of the 42nd were better known among their compatriots as the Black Watch, or Am Franken den Dof in the Scottish Gaelic dialect. There were a lot.
I should point out that in Scottish it would be Gaelic, not Gaelic. It's something I learned when I was in Scotland. Largely the same language with some differences, but Irish is Gaelic, in Scottish it's pronounced Gaelic.
Of unverified stories of how the unit earned the nickname. The most plausible was one regarding the dark colors of the tartan worn by the men, coupled with what they were required to do.
Which looks awesome.
Besides the recognizable dark tartan plaid, the Black Watch soldiers originally wore scarlet waistcoats and jackets with buff facings and blue tam o' shanter headgear. In the late 18th century, they adopted the red hackle on their caps, which became the most distinctive part of their uniforms. Even though they were initially raised to maintain order in Scotland, men of the 42nd Regiment were soon deployed overseas. They fought in the Americas, North Africa, and Europe in wars against the French. Until the end of the 19th century, they served their sovereign in the Crimean War, India, Egypt, Sudan, and the Boer Wars.
It just goes to show you how many places the British Army was involved over the years. Here in the U.S., in terms of our soldiers going to other countries to fight, in the 19th century, you have the Mexican War. You have a little bit in the War of 1812, but it's all pretty local. You have the Mexican War in the 1840s, and then you get all the way to the end of the century with 1898 when you've got Cuba and the Philippines. But for the most part, U.S. Army units are staying at home during all this time. It's only in the 20th century that starts happening. British Army's all over the place.
With the onset of World War I in 1914, the Black Watch was there to serve once again. 25 battalions were raised by the regiment during the war.
So there you go. There's 25 battalions of Black Watch, and they weren't all serving in the same division, the same corps, even the same army, or even the same front. They're all over the place.
Of which most fought in the trenches of the Western Front. 2 battalions fought on the battlefields of the Middle East and the Balkans as well. The bravery and tenacity displayed in combat was shown in the battles in which they fought. From Givenchy to Marne, with Festubert, Somme, Mesopotamia, Arras, and Ypres in between, the enemy got to know what it was like to fight the Highlanders.
Yep, they were ferocious.
The Germans called them Der Damen aus der Hölle, the ladies from hell.
Again, not sure that's really true. In fact, I want to look this up a little bit. So here's just one of many sources. There's absolutely no doubt that the nicknames Ladies from Hell or Devils in Skirts were neither invented or used by German soldiers to describe kilted Scottish troops. It's simple fact that German sources do not mention that nickname at all. The contemporary sources available are never German and always refer to Allied soldiers using those names to describe themselves. Even if attributed to the Germans, nowhere is there any factual or anecdotal evidence that a German soldier ever used them. It's important to know that German soldier slang hardly had any flattering, contemptuous, or scoffing nicknames for a foe. Usually, Germans did not differentiate between English, Scottish, or even Australian troops. They were all typically called Englanders,
in reference to the kilts they wore and their ferocity in combat. From the Battle of Mons at the beginning of the war to the final assault against the Hindenburg Line in 1918, the Black Watch's distinct uniform, together with the sound of their bagpipes, made their presence felt on battlefields across Europe during World War I.
Love it.
Unlike previous campaigns, uniforms in the British Army during World War I prioritized camouflage in the trenches over parade aesthetics and regimental flags or standards. Gone were the days of lining up in rows to fire volleys. Now it was time to dig deep into the mud and prepare to repel massive assaults and take cover from the artillery bombardments.
You know, necessity is the mother of invention, and especially in wartime, we see giant leaps in technology and giant changes from the beginning of a war to the end, if that war lasts for any length of time. The nature of warfare in 1914 bears very little resemblance to the nature of warfare in 1918. Big changes happening, changes in uniforms, changes in helmets, changes in having tanks on the battlefield, changes in tactics, changes in the use of airplanes.
Black Watch buttons, shoulder titles, and the famous dark tartan pattern kilt completed the uniform. Later, in response to the muddy, horrific conditions of trench warfare, kilt aprons and covers became standard issue once again to protect the uniforms from getting wet and dirty, as they first appeared to be worn by Highland troops during the Boer Wars. These kilt covers came in two variations: a fully wrapped around design which featured a front pocket and another front apron design. Both covers had a cotton drawstring that tied around the soldier's waist, but where the fully wrapped version included a pleated rear, the apron only offered protection from the front. Many Black Watch soldiers wore a sporran, or a leather pouch that acted as a pocket. This was one of their most prized pieces of clothing.
And this is something you typically see when you see people wearing an outfit that involves a kilt today, and that's that kind of part that hangs down in the front.
The kilts worn by the regiment did not have pockets, so men would utilize the sporran as a functional piece of clothing to store coins, fire-making equipment, or any other number of small useful items. Accompanying the kilt and sporran were the various types of headdresses used, including the bonnet with the red hackle, the Glengarry cap, and the tam-o'-shanter. The weapons and equipment used by the Black Watch included the Lee Enfield Mark I SMLE bolt-action rifle.
Such a fantastic weapon, the Lee Enfield. Such a good weapon. One day I want to get my hands on one.
The 1907 pattern bayonet that they carried on their webbing allowed the soldiers to fix the blade onto their rifle when mounting charges across no man's land to take enemy trenches.
So it's important to note, too, if you're not real familiar with uniforms, the webbing is basically that all the gear they're wearing on top of their uniform, the stuff that holds their ammunition and their bayonets and any other stuff they might need, their entrenching tool and their canteen, all that stuff is kind of hanging on them, and the webbing kind of holds it all together so you can kind of take it all on, or put it all on or off easily.
Before the war, the Black Watch consisted of 7 battalions. 2 of these, the 1st and 2nd, were regular battalions. The 3rd belonged to a special reserve, while the 4th, Dundee, 5th, Angus, 6th, Perthshire, and 7th, Fife, were part of the Territorial Force. Over the course of the war, this Territorial Force mobilized 12 new battalions. In addition, another 5 battalions were formed within Kitchener's new army.
So Kitchener, you see his picture right there. It's a very iconic image, that recruitment poster of Kitchener. Kitchener died during the war in the sinking of a ship that he was on, but he was the Secretary of State for War. Basically, the equivalent in the United States today would be Secretary of Defense, or back in those days, the Secretary of War. And he understood very early on that the relatively small British Army including the territorial forces, which were basically there to as a home guard, like a national guard kind of thing, that was not going to be enough. He knew this was going to be a long war, that massive numbers of soldiers were going to be needed, and that's where you see the development of these, initially I think they were called service battalions. A lot of them were the PALS battalions. These were the units that were either volunteers or eventually conscripts that were raised in huge numbers early on in the war, and that's why you get going from something like 7 battalions of Black Watch to over 20 of them.
Plus, there was also one labor battalion. The first unit to arrive in France and experience the fighting was the 1st Battalion. They took part in the retreat from Mons and had a baptism by fire in the Battle of Givenchy from the 18th to the 22nd of December 1914. In this battle, the 2nd Battalion also took part before they were deployed to Mesopotamia to fight against the Turks. Then in 1915, the battalions of the Territorial Army and Kitchener's Army began to arrive in France. The severity of the combat immediately started to take a toll on the Black Watch. Even though the Highlanders fought bravely at Festubert, where they earned 2 Victoria Crosses, and Loos, they suffered heavy casualties. At Loos alone, the 9th Battalion had over 700 losses.
And to put that in perspective, I think the full complement of a British battalion would be 1,100 men, but most of them, after the war got started, did not have nearly that many. A lot of them went into combat with 700 or 800. So for them to lose that many was just horrifying.
In 1916, the Battle of the Somme left the bloodiest mark on the Black Watch. Like most of the British units engaged in the battle, the Highlanders too were heavily involved in a fight that lasted for more than 4 months. 5 battalions of the Black Watch fought in the battle. The most notable actions were taken by the 6th and 7th Battalion at the High Wood, and by the 8th Battalion at the Delville Wood and the village of Longueville. On July 8, 1916, during the 8th day of the battle, the 8th Battalion of the Black Watch arrived at the front line and were deployed on the far right of the 9th Scottish Division. For the first few days, they prepared for the anticipated offensive. Finally, early in the morning of July 14th, following a heavy artillery barrage, the bagpipes announced the attack by the 8th Battalion on German positions in Delville Wood and Longueville. The sound of these bagpipes and the fierce onslaught by the Black Watch initially took the Germans by surprise. However, they quickly recovered and put up a stiff resistance.
You have to understand that this attack of the Somme, for so many reasons, was such a disaster. Among others, the fact that the Germans had been there in those entrenchments for the better part of 2 years. They were on higher ground in most places, had much better entrenchments than the British did. The Germans had dug down deep. They had these, sometimes down 30, 40 feet in the ground with light and, furniture, and they had really used the time wisely to dig in. So they had powerful entrenchments that it was very difficult, although the British Army did eventually take the ground in November. That's why there were just so many devastating casualties.
Despite the hail of bullets from German machine guns and the artillery barrage from the woods, the Highlanders reached the village and engaged the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. The well-organized German in-depth defense made the job of seizing the village extremely difficult and exhausting.
So defense in depth, it's called. Basically what the Germans had developed by this point was multiple trenches, and the front line trench was not the strongest trench. They would leave kind of a smaller outpost there, and then had stronger lines behind it. And so by doing that, you kind of expect that the front line trenches are going to get overrun, but that buys you time to be prepared to kind of counterattack, or to be prepared to kind of throw it back with stronger lines in the back. And it was a very effective strategy.
Nonetheless, for 5 days, the men of the 8th Division fought hard, and after driving the enemy out, managed to repel many counterattacks. The most intense fighting was on July 18th, which started with a heavy bombardment of the Longueville area and the Delville Wood. With the help of the 7th Seaforths and the 5th Camerons, the 8th Black Watch held the line that they had established in the village earlier, but paid a heavy price for their efforts. At one point, the battalion was reduced to only 171 men. The 8th Battalion sustained 568 casualties in Longueville and Delville Wood.
Wow.
On July 19th, due to their heavy casualties and battle fatigue, they were relieved by the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. Not far from there, the 6th and 7th Battalions of the Black Watch were thrown into a real bloodbath at Highwood. This position was the highest point on the ridge above the Somme Valley and provided an excellent overview of the battle. The British wanted to get a hold of it, but the Germans were determined not to give it up. The fighting around the ridge began on July 14th with unsuccessful attempts to reach the German lines. Despite the heavy barrage thrown on them, the Germans repelled every single British attack, inflicting heavy casualties. For 2 weeks, the British troops, including the 6th and 7th Black Watch, were dying in vain trying to reach the Highwood. On the evening of July 30th, 1916, the British made one more attempt to conquer the ridge. Men of the Black Watch were tasked with capturing the eastern and western corners of the enemy positions. The artillery bombardment that lasted for almost an entire day gave little results. The German defense was as strong as it was before. Met with devastating machine gun fire and German shelling, the Black Watch continued pushing forward until they were 25 yards from the German barbed wire. But that was as far as they would get. The 7th Highlanders were held up in a redoubt in the high wood, while the men of the 6th Battalion had to take shelter in muddy, water-filled shell holes in the ground. The attack ended in bitter disappointment. The high wood remained out of reach of the British, and too many bodies were left in no man's land.
And I talk about this all the time, but one of the just horrific aspects of this war was the fact that you were very often walking around in trenches where men were dead or buried underneath your feet in some cases, or your buddy that got killed in the previous day's attack is still laying out there dead, or the previous month's attack. And a lot of times they would start digging mines because before these big attacks, they would dig mines to get underneath the German lines. And every so often the miners, these mining companies would be digging and they'd hit graves. They'd hit the bodies of dead soldiers that had been in previous attacks who had sunk down into the ground. It was just, I mean, every aspect of this, from the artillery to the machine gun fire to the weather to the conditions in the trenches to the way the bodies were just left everywhere, and the disease and the gas. It's just such a nightmare.
Men of the Black Watch tried to rescue their wounded comrades under cover of the night. On that day, the Black Watch lost 154 men. The heroism and the bloodshed of the Black Watch continued until the very end of the war. Their relentless determination carried on into the 2nd and 3rd battles of Arras and the 3rd Battle of Ypres, where the 4th and 5th battalions were reduced to no more than company strength. By the time of the armistice, on November 11, 1918, the Black Watch had lost 8,000 men. However, for the outstanding bravery shown during the conflict, the regiment was awarded 25 battle honors and 4 Victoria Crosses, the highest and most prestigious award a British soldier could earn. The Black Watch's contribution during World War I was just another chapter in the glorious history of one of the finest regiments in the British Army.
Finest regiments in the world. Love the Black Watch. So glad they did that story. I definitely plan to highlight them when I go to Belgium, to the battlefields of Ypres in a few weeks. If you have another unit that you think I should look into, that you know something about and you think has an amazing history that's worth talking about, please let me know. Would love to highlight other units like the Black Watch. As always, please hit that like button if you would. If you think I've earned it, please consider subscribing. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.